All right, welcome back, and thank you for bearing with me during an extended holiday break. But it's time to get back to some steroid myths. In the last video I did back in December, I talked about whether steroids were the primary cause of sluggers getting so big in the 1990s. I said no, and I gave a bunch of reasons why not, but there's one reason I didn't include very much because it's actually so important I wanted to give it its own video. And that is that steroid use was not mainly concentrated among sluggers in the first place. In other words, steroids didn't turn guys into big home run hitters because it wasn't really big home run hitters who were using steroids at all. To me, this is one of the real smoking guns about steroids that ought to have shattered a lot of these myths. When rumors about steroid use in baseball first started to bubble up in the 90s, all the speculation focused on guys like Jose Canseco and Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, big hulking home run hitters who supposedly used steroids to get so big and then hit dingers. When Ken Caminiti confessed to Sports Illustrated in 2002, it seemed to confirm these suspicions. Here was a big guy who'd hit 40 home runs in his MVP season when he was admitting to being on PEDs. So that was the mental image of a steroid user that existed in everyone's head. A big, strong guy who hit a lot of home runs. But over time, we've learned more about who was actually using these drugs. Steroid testing has now been part of baseball for about 2 decades, not to mention players who have been outed through various other means, whether that's from reporting or government investigations into Balco or biogenesis or other illegal steroid rings. We obviously don't have a full list of everyone who ever did steroids, but we do have more information than we used to, and we can update that mental image we have of a steroid user. Because it turns out it's not mainly guys like Canseco and McGwire and Caminiti using these drugs. It's actually a lot of relief pitchers and backup infielders. I remember when steroid testing first officially started in 2005, and there was kind of an anxious feeling among baseball fans over who would be the first player to fail a drug test. People were wondering, would the test catch Barry Bonds or Jason Giambi or some other home run hitter? But as it turned out, the first baseball player ever officially suspended for steroid use was a guy named Alex Sanchez, a sort of fringe outfielder who to that point in his career had played 4 seasons and hit a grand total of 4 home runs. Sanchez was really a speed and defense guy. He stole a lot of bases and played center field, but he hit for almost no power. His career slugging percentage was well below 400, almost 50 points below the league average. Which, okay, fine, that was weird, but it was only one player. Sanchez claimed he had taken some over-the-counter supplement that had a banned substance in it, and he had just been negligent. So maybe it was a fluke failed test, maybe it was a weird thing. But then the next failed test belonged to a guy named Jorge Piedra, who hit 3 home runs in his career to that point. Then came Juan Rincon, a relief pitcher, followed by Jamal Strong, who had 26 career plate appearances and 0 home runs. And it turns out this is the pattern that would emerge for the entirety of baseball's drug testing regime. As of this recording, before the start of the 2024 season, there are 73 different major leaguers who were suspended for steroid use under baseball's joint drug agreement. That's 73 guys who were on major league rosters when the suspensions came down. And almost none of them conform to the mental image we have of the big-muscled home run hitter. For one, 33 of them, over 45% of the total, are pitchers. The prominence of pitchers on every steroid list that has come out should really have changed our conception of what steroids do. How could steroids explain the home run boom of the 1990s if almost half the guys using steroids were pitchers whose whole job is not to give up home runs? Either steroids do confer an advantage on pitchers, in which case the rise of steroids can't be used to explain a surge in offensive production, since any advantage gained by hitters would be offset by the advantage gained by pitchers, or steroids don't confer an advantage on pitchers, and pitchers are using steroids even though they're not getting anything from them. But then you have to acknowledge that sometimes players use illegal drugs and don't get any benefit from those drugs, which would also undermine the idea that steroids caused the home run surge of the 1990s. But because people were so committed to the idea that steroids could explain that home run surge, they never updated the mental image of a steroid user that they had in their heads. For almost every baseball fan to this day, a quote-unquote steroid guy is a guy who hits a lot of home runs, even after decades of evidence to the contrary. And look, every couple years, there were the occasional star hitter who did fail a drug test, keeping that original image alive. Rafael Palmeiro failed to test in 2005, Manny Ramirez in 2009, Ryan Braun in 2011, Robinson Cano in 2018, and Fernando Tatis Jr. just a couple years ago in 2021. But that's really only a handful of the total, a small minority of players who actually failed drug tests. It's worth saying that even these guys don't really correspond to the picture of a jacked slugger we have of it from the 1990s. Rafael Palmeiro was a Gold Glove first baseman who had 3,000 career hits. Ryan Braun was a 30-30 guy who was listed at only 200 pounds. Cano did have a couple years where he hit over 30 home runs, but he wasn't really a home run hitter. He was a high average guy who hit line drives more than towering shots. And if you stepped back and looked at the full list of players who failed drug tests, you quickly saw that even these guys were the exceptions. Even if you ignore all the pitchers who failed tests and only looked at everyday players, you'd still see that very few of them were home run hitters. Of the 40 hitters who have been suspended for PEDs, over half of them never hit more than 20 home runs in a single season. I went through every guy on that list of 73 and asked, is this player a power hitter? And my definition was extremely broad. I was just looking for two easy criteria. Guys who had 3 seasons where they played 60 games and had a slugging percentage above the league average. That is, was this guy a semi-regular player, and did he hit for slightly more power than average? By this low standard, I'm including guys like Matt Lawton and Wellington Castillo as power hitters, even though nobody would have ever called them that while they were playing. And still, even with this liberal standard for who counts as a home run hitter, over a third of the hitters who failed drug tests do not qualify. When you combine that with the pitchers on the list, you're left with just 25 out of 73 players, barely a third of those suspended for PED use, who meet even the broadest possible definition of a power hitter. And by the way, this list of 73 doesn't even include the 80 players who were in the minor leagues or playing in a foreign league by the time their suspensions came down, adding even more weak hitters and pitchers to that list of guys who failed drug tests. Now, the common response to this is to say that steroid testing is unreliable and can't be trusted. It's too easy to beat these steroid tests. We know that some guys who definitely took illegal substances never failed a drug test. Of course, that would only explain why the proportions are so off if exclusively power hitters were able to avoid getting caught by these tests, and there's no reason to believe that's true. Are there secret undetectable steroids that they only tell you about when you hit 30 home runs in a season? I don't think so. But fine, we can ignore the steroid test if you want, because there are other means of identifying steroid users. If you look at the Mitchell report, for example, that report names 85 players, most of whom were identified based on the testimony of Kirk Radomski, a former Mets clubhouse employee who claimed that he helped secure drugs for dozens of players over his years with the team. There's also the Balco investigation into various illegal online pharmacies, and then we can throw in biogenesis into the mix, even though that happened several years after the Mitchell report came out. Now, I want to be clear that I think a lot of these investigations are basically witch hunts, and that someone's presence on one of these lists should not be taken as definitive proof against that individual. If you look into the evidence in a lot of these cases, it's pretty shaky. And given the way we use these lists to destroy people's legacies and reputations, it's really not fair. But for our purposes, in this video, we're not looking at the case against any individual player. We're looking at the steroid users as a group and trying to compare them to the mental image we have in our heads of what a steroid user looks like. And in fact, if you look at the lists from the Mitchell report and the Balco investigation and biogenesis, what you see is again similar to the list of people who failed drug tests. Once again, over a third of the players named are pitchers, and almost half of the hitters mentioned did not meet my definition of a power hitter. Instead, what you see is a lot of names like F.P. Santangelo, Manny Alexander, and Bobby Estalella, utility infielders, backup catchers, career pinch runners, guys like that. We just don't remember those names. When people think of Balco, they think of Barry Bonds. When they think of biogenesis, they remember A-Rod or Manny Ramirez. But those are the exceptions. Most of the players involved in these scandals were not big power hitters or stars. And this really ought to undermine the idea that steroids provide some advantage to baseball players at all. To put it quite simply and plainly, if steroids helped baseball players hit home runs, then you would expect to find disproportionately home run hitters on a list of steroid users. But you don't. If steroids help players with any offensive production in general, then you would expect to find disproportionately hitters on a list of steroid users. But you don't. If steroids helped you improve in any way, just by giving you strength or endurance, or if they were just like magic beans that made you good at baseball the way they are often talked about by fans and media, then you would expect to find disproportionately good players on a list of steroid users. But you don't. If you actually look at the list of players who are caught using steroids objectively, without any preconceived ideas about who they are or what steroids help you do, then a very different profile starts to emerge. What do guys like Alex Sanchez and Jamal Strong and Bobby Estalella and Francisco Cervelli really have in common? The answer is that they're desperate. These are players who are operating on the fringe of Major League Baseball. They're not stars. They are one slump or one bad stretch of games away from getting sent back to the minor leagues. So of course they're more likely to take desperate action to try to gain any edge, like taking some drug they've been told is performance enhancing. Even a lot of the more prominent players who we know failed drug tests or we know use illegal substances fit this desperate criteria. Guys who were recovering from an injury or first breaking into the league. We talked in the A-Rod Chronicles about how Alex Rodriguez first sought out biogenesis when persistent lower body injuries started sapping his power in 2010. But as I said about A-Rod, and as we can see from looking at the careers of guys who failed steroid tests and who were otherwise caught, that doesn't mean these drugs actually worked. The fact that a few desperate players are willing to try drugs doesn't prove they do anything for you. Desperation causes people to do lots of stupid things that don't work. And whatever the motivation, the important thing is that yet again, the facts and the data we have about steroids do not come close to matching the myths we've built up in our heads. The conventional wisdom is that steroids explain why hitters started to hit more home runs in the 1990s. But not only are there alternative explanations that better match the facts and the timeline, as I've laid out in previous videos, but the guys doing steroids weren't even the ones hitting the home runs. Obviously, there are some big exceptions to this, and that's who we remember and who we care about. Bonds, McGuire, A-Rod, Ramirez. And if they had been the only ones using steroids, that would really tell us something. But they weren't, and our focus on them, while understandable, obscures the fundamental truth about steroids in baseball.